Welcome to part 10 of A Cartoonist Guide to the Gospel of Mark. In this video, we are actually switching over and moving to part 3 of this amazing story. We're going to be looking at chapter 11, starting in verse 1 and moving through chapter 12, verse 27. This is page 16 and 17 of A Cartoonist Guide to Mark. So let's dive in. All right, as we scan the page 16, we see that we've coming to the famous triumphal entry. But I want to highlight that there's actually 3 days and 3 separate entries that Jesus makes in the beginning of what we also know as Holy Week. So we have the first day, 1, which is the big triumphal entry, and then we have day 2, where Jesus cleanses the temple, and then day 3, where Jesus curses the fig tree. So let's come down here and let's just walk through the PowerPoint. Now, Jesus has finally arrived at Jerusalem, and he gets on the back of a donkey, and the people gather there on the Mount of coming from Bethany on the road to Jerusalem at the Mount of Olives, and they start waving palm branches at him, and they start shouting, "Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hosanna in the highest heaven." What they're actually doing here is they're quoting Psalm 118. Hosanna means save us. So they're crying out to Jesus to be the one who, like David, would rescue them from their enemies and save them in their time of trial. And it's interesting that Jesus rides on the back of a donkey, because a donkey was a sign of peace. If a king was riding on a donkey, that is a donkey is a common working animal. If a king was at war, a king would be riding on the back of a horse. And so that's just an interesting aspect of this story. So that's his first day. He leaves. On his second day, he comes in and he sees that there is a fig tree, and he's hungry, and he sees that there are no figs on this fig tree. And so he curses the fig tree. He says, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again," which seems really harsh. But then the next thing that Jesus does is he goes into the temple. And remember, the temple is the center of Jewish worship. And this, according to Mark's story, this is the first time Jesus enters the temple. And he says, he gets really angry because he notices that there are money changers there. Because what was the practice was that people would pilgrimage to Jerusalem and to make their big sacrifices for the Passover celebration. But it was difficult to bring animals long distances. And so it was acceptable for people to actually purchase their animals when they got to the temple. And the religious leaders were taking advantage of this. And in one way or another, they were extorting the people and taking advantage of the people and making money off of the people in this important day of worship. And Jesus got really upset with that. And so he flips over their tables and drives out the money changers. And he says, "Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers." Well, you can imagine this does not make him very popular with the religious leaders. And they say amongst themselves, "We need to kill him." But the people are spellbound by him. So they're in a tough spot, because if they actually take Jesus out, the people will rebel against them. So they're not sure exactly what to do. So you'll see in this coming week of this of Jesus' life, they try to trap him with different tests. So at the end of that story, when evening came on that second day, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. So when they come back on day 3, they notice that the fig tree that Jesus cursed was dried up. And Jesus says to his disciples, "Have faith in God. Truly, I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. Whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father in heaven may also forgive you your trespasses." Now, this is a very difficult story to make sense out of if you just think it's about a fig tree. But I think what's going on here is that the fig tree is a metaphor for the temple, and more importantly, a metaphor for the leadership of the people, of the religious leaders in Jerusalem, because Jesus is serving as a prophet, just like all the prophets of the Hebrew scriptures. And he is speaking truth to power that has become corrupted, power that has forgotten its purpose. And instead of leading the people into life according to the ways of God revealed through Moses and the Torah and the prophets, the leaders are being self-serving. They're making money off of the people, and they are allowing the empire to continue to oppress the people. And so the fig tree is not producing the fruit that it's supposed to do. The leaders are not producing the fruit that they're supposed to do. And so Jesus says that this is going to wither and this is going to come to an end. But he's encouraging his disciples, don't be too discouraged, because God will continue to be faithful and new things are going to happen. All right, now let's jump to page 17 and continue the story. So after Jesus talks about the fig tree being withered, now he comes back to the temple. This is now the third day. And starting in chapter 11, verse 27, let's jump down here and walk through the PowerPoint. So of course, the religious leaders, they've had the night to think about it. They're very angry with Jesus for upsetting their money changing tables. And so they come after him and they ask him, by what authority are you doing these things? And Jesus answers by asking them a question. He says, answer this and I'll tell you. Did the baptism of John come from heaven or from human origin? And they were afraid of the crowds, so they were afraid to answer. And so they just said, we don't know. So Jesus said, well, then I won't tell you. So he's playing into their own game of fear and perceptions and public image. But what he does do is he tells them a parable. He says, a man planted a vineyard, leased it out, and then went away. He tried to collect his share, and so he sent his servants to collect his share, but they beat his servants and sent him back. And then they killed the servant, and then finally he sent his son, and they killed his son. And so Jesus said that the landowner said, I will destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. And then the leaders, they realized that he had told this parable against them, and they wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowd, so they left him and went away. Then the story continues. Pharisees and Herodians come to Jesus to try to trap him. And they ask him, is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor? And so Jesus says, let me see a coin. Whose image is on this coin? And they say, well, it's Caesar's. It's the emperor's image. So Jesus says, then give him what's his and give God what is God's. Then the Sadducees come to him, who the Sadducees, remember, are those who say there is no resurrection, and they try to trap him. And they ask him a question. They think they're going to trick him. They say, there is a woman who has been married 7 times. She's had 7 husbands. And so each one of them has died. So in the resurrection, which one is she married to? And Jesus says, when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. See, Jesus is a troublemaker. Well, at least he is for the religious leaders. I mean, the key word in this whole story is authority. The question is, who is in charge of the situation? Is it the religious leaders? Is it Herod? Is it Rome? Is it the crowd? Is it God? So in classic Jesus fashion, as a good rabbi, he doesn't give the leaders a direct response. He knows their hearts. He knows they are driven by fear and the need to seem like they are in control, when the truth is that their country is spiraling out of control. And so Jesus doesn't play their game. So in this parable of the vineyard, Jesus does not respond directly to the leader's question. Instead, he tells them a parable. Now, parables, they're always difficult to interpret. They're intentionally open-ended. They don't provide answers. They invite the listener to lean in more and ask better questions. So it seems clear that Jesus is drawing from a common prophetic imagery. The vineyard is a symbol of Israel throughout the prophets, and it's most clearly seen in Isaiah chapter 5, 1 through 11. And it's puzzling why Jesus ends his parable with a quote from Psalm 118. This psalm is labeled a song of victory, and the psalmist rejoices because the people have just survived a time of siege. The people were surrounded, all seemed lost, but God delivered them. So apparently the psalmist, perhaps David, led the people into victory and is giving all the credit to God. Perhaps the psalmist is the stone the builders rejected, remembering the slaves of Egypt that became the people of God, remembering the anointing of David that Saul did not recognize. And now he sits on the throne and will unify the kingdom. He becomes the cornerstone. What is Jesus doing here by combining the image of the rented vineyard and wicked tenants with the victory psalm? Perhaps the time is up for the leaders. The vineyard must be purged once again. The author knows that the temple would be destroyed in AD 70. Yet perhaps Jesus is also comforting the crowd that all is not lost. The temple is more than the gilded stones that Herod built. Even though they kill the son, he is not defeated. The unlikely carpenter's son from Nazareth will lead the people into the true temple of God, beyond brick and mortar, which expands to the whole world. Now let's talk a little bit more about the temple. In these two stories where Jesus is being trapped by the Pharisees, one group is the Pharisees and Herodians, the other group is the Sadducees. Let's walk through this PowerPoint here. So first of all, when we think about the temple, we have to understand the evolution of the temple. At Mount Sinai, God gave instructions to Moses and the people to build a tabernacle, which is a tent. So here's a drawing that I made of the tabernacle in relation to the size of an American football field. So it's about 50 yards long in total, right? So we can kind of imagine the size of this. Now, this is a portable tent. When the pillar of cloud and fire got up and moved, the people would roll up this tent and they would move and follow God. And then wherever the pillar stopped, they would pitch the tent. Well, Solomon wanted to build a temple. And so Solomon abandoned the tabernacle and built a permanent structure, but it was built on the same blueprint as the tabernacle. So here is a drawing of what Solomon's temple may have looked like. That temple got destroyed by the Babylonians and it was rebuilt. But then centuries later, when Herod the Great became in power, he started a building expansion project. And this is what his temple looked like. I mean, it's humongous. And you can kind of see Herod's ego in how he built the temple. And so this is the temple that Jesus was encountering, which is a gross exaggeration and distortion of the original blueprint of the tabernacle. And so in light of this Herod's temple, Jesus is now having this conversation with the religious leaders, with the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes. And they ask him about taxes. And so he says, give to Caesar what's his. The Sadducees ask him about doctrine. And he says that's the wrong question. And we'll see in the next video that Jesus encounters the scribes and they say, what about the law? All right, so these first two conversations are the beginning of the testing and trials of Jesus, and we'll continue this conversation in the next video.